fiction brain masterclass on the self-editing ladder. Most writers think of editing as one thing. You finish the draft, you go back through it, you fix what's broken. Maybe you do it twice, maybe 3 times. And somewhere in that process, you feel the manuscript getting cleaner, tighter, better. What most writers don't realize is that they're doing all of that work at the same altitude. They're moving through the manuscript at sentence level, catching awkward phrasing, tightening dialogue, smoothing rhythm, while the structural questions, the big questions about whether the story actually works, go unasked. Sentence-level editing applied to a structurally broken story is repainting a house whose foundation has cracked. The paint looks better. The foundation is still cracked. Professional editing is not one activity. It is a sequence of distinct activities, each operating at a different altitude, each looking for problems the other levels cannot see. That sequence has a name. It's called the editing ladder. And working it from the top down, from the highest altitude to the ground level, is one of the most important disciplines a serious writer can develop. Today we're going to walk the ladder together. 6 rungs. Each one doing work the others can't. Before we go rung by rung, here's the full sequence so you can hold it in view. Rung 1 is developmental editing, the highest altitude, where you ask whether the story works as a whole. Rung 2 is structural and content editing, 1 level down, where you ask whether each scene is doing its job. Rung 3 is line editing, the prose level, where you ask whether the writing itself is alive and precise. Rung 4 is copy editing, correctness and consistency, grammar, punctuation, and adherence to a style guide. Rung 5 is continuity auditing, the internal lordship of the manuscript held consistent across every page. And Rung 6 is voice and tone editing, whether the narrative voice remains consistent from the first chapter to the last. 6 rungs. And here's the discipline the ladder requires. You finish each one before you start the next. You do not line edit a scene you haven't yet decided to keep. You do not copy edit dialogue you may rebuild. The ladder keeps your revision effort pointed at work that will survive. Let's begin with rung 1, developmental editing. Developmental editing works at the highest altitude. This is where you ask whether your story works as a whole before you look at a single sentence. Does the story deliver on its opening promise, that implicit contract the first pages make with the reader about the kind of experience they're going to have? Does the protagonist's arc carry from wound to change, with the right connective tissue in between? Does the thematic argument hold together across the full manuscript? Are there subplots that vanish for 60 pages and return without earning their reappearance? These are structural questions. And structural questions are invisible at sentence level. You cannot find them by moving through the manuscript line by line. Developmental editing requires distance from the manuscript. Most writers need weeks away before they can read their own work as a reader, rather than as the person who wrote it. For longer work, months is not excessive. The developmental pass is a diagnostic read, not a line-by-line edit. You read the manuscript as a whole. You make notes. You ask the hard questions before you touch the prose. Consider this example. A thriller writer finishes her manuscript and immediately begins editing. She tightens the opening chapter, sharpens the second act, polishes the climax. She queries agents. The rejections all say the same thing in different language. The plot doesn't hold together. The protagonist's motivation in Act 2 contradicts the character established in Act 1. The resolution depends on information the reader was never given. Sentence-level editing could not have found this. It was invisible at ground level. It was only visible from altitude. Now we move to rung 2, structural and content editing. 1 level below developmental work, structural editing moves through the manuscript scene by scene. Where developmental editing asks whether the story works, structural editing asks whether each piece of the story is doing its job. The structural question for every scene is the same. Does this scene create change? A change in a relationship, a power dynamic, a belief, a piece of knowledge. A scene that ends with the same configuration it began is a static scene. Static scenes are decoration. And decoration earns its place only when it's serving another purpose, building atmosphere, establishing character, preparing the reader for what comes next. Most decoration should be cut. Structural editing also asks whether cause and effect holds across the manuscript, whether reveals arrive at the right moment, whether the protagonist drives events forward or only watches them unfold. Here's an example. A discovery writer does his developmental read and the story works at altitude. He then does a structural pass and finds that 5 consecutive chapters are a sequence in which his protagonist observes other characters doing things. He reacts. He never acts. Those chapters are decorative in structural terms. The story moves around him, instead of because of him. They need to be rebuilt. Now, we climb down to rung 3, line editing. Line editing works at the prose level. Not grammar, not punctuation, those belong to the rung below. Line editing is concerned with sentence rhythm, word choice, precision, image clarity, tonal consistency, and whether the narrative voice remains alive and specific on every page. This is the altitude most writers reach for too soon. Line editing is for prose that has earned its place in the manuscript. You don't refine the rhythm of dialogue, you may rebuild. Voice drift is among the most important things line editing finds. A novel written over 18 months is rarely written in a single sustained mood. Early chapters and late chapters often carry different rhythms, different emotional temperatures, different relationships with the reader. The line editing pass is where that drift becomes visible. Here's an example. A passage reads, "She felt a kind of sad feeling come over her as she looked at the old house." 3 problems in one sentence. A kind of sad feeling is approximate. What feeling exactly? Come over her is passive. She's a bystander to her own emotion. Old house is generic. The revision reads, "The house looked smaller than she remembered, and that made everything worse." Specific. Active. Earned. Now to rung 4, copy editing. Copy editing is concerned with correctness and consistency. It operates in 2 categories. External consistency means adherence to a recognized style guide, a published rulebook for language decisions. The 2 most common in fiction are Chicago Manual of Style, the standard in U.S. book publishing, and AP Style, standard in journalism and magazine work. A style guide doesn't need to be memorized. It needs to be on the shelf so that when a question arises, you have an authoritative answer rather than a guess. Internal consistency means the manuscript's own established rules. Character name spellings, place names, whether a particular term is capitalized throughout, these decisions are yours. Copy editing ensures you applied them the same way on page 200 as you did on page 12. Here's an example. A character named Mallory throughout the manuscript becomes Mallory in 2 scenes near the end. A timeline places an event on a Thursday. 2 chapters later, a character references it as having happened last weekend. A town called Reston on page 10 is Preston on page 214. None of these are visible at developmental or structural altitude. Copy editing finds them all. Now we reach rung 5, continuity auditing. Continuity auditing is rarely named as a separate function. Most editors fold it into developmental or copy work. But for long, complex manuscripts, it deserves its own pass. Continuity is the internal logic of the manuscript held consistent across every page. A character established as left-handed in Chapter 3 should not throw a punch with her right hand in Chapter 19. A plot event placed on a specific date should not contradict the timeline 2 chapters later. Short fiction rarely needs a dedicated continuity pass. Long fiction almost always does. Here's an example. A historical novel establishes that a character runs a steel mill on the south bank of the river. 7 chapters later, another character describes visiting that mill on the north side of town. Neither scene is wrong on its own. Together, they create a quiet inconsistency that no reader will consciously name, but that many readers will feel as a vague sense that something is off. Finally, rung 6, voice and tone editing. Voice drift is one of the hardest problems for a writer to self-diagnose, precisely because it happens gradually and the writer is inside it. A novel written over 18 months is rarely written in a single sustained mood. Voice and tone editing asks whether the narrative voice remains consistent from the first chapter to the last. The same sentence rhythm, the same emotional temperature, the same relationship with the reader. It produces a diagnostic report, not a corrected manuscript. It tells you where the drift occurred and what the nature of the drift is. The revision decisions remain yours. Here's an example. A writer begins her novel with a first-person narrator who is wry and observational, keeping a slight emotional distance from events. By the final third, the narrator has become earnest and unguarded, speaking directly about her feelings. Neither mode is wrong. Together, they create a narrator who seems like 2 different people. And the shift was so gradual, the writer never noticed it happening. Every serious editing process produces one more document. The style sheet? It's the single reference that captures every consistency decision made during the edit. And it's one of the most useful tools most fiction writers have never created. A style sheet has 6 working sections. The word and style consistency list records specific word choices and spelling decisions with the reasoning behind each, preventing the same word from being handled differently across hundreds of pages. The style rules section documents formatting conventions for punctuation, capitalization, numbers, and dialogue mechanics. These are the decisions that fall between hard grammar rules and personal preference. The character roster lists every named character with role, physical details, and any facts established in the text, catching name misspellings and description contradictions before they reach a reader. The settings index records every named location with its established details, preventing the mill that moves from the South Bank to the North Bank. The timeline section gives a chapter-by-chapter summary of when events occur and what happens in sequence. It's the most powerful continuity tool in the document. And the craft and editorial notes section is the one most writers don't expect. It's where you record structural, voice, or clarity problems that fall outside strict copy editing. Unresolved threads, payoff failures, anything you found but haven't yet solved, so it doesn't get buried and forgotten before your next pass. Most writers discover, when they build their first style sheet, that their manuscript has made more quiet inconsistencies than they realized. That discovery is the style sheet doing its job. In closing, the ladder changes how you think about revision. Not as one long pass through the manuscript looking for anything wrong, but as a sequence of focused passes, each one operating at a defined altitude, each one finding what the others cannot. Developmental first, structural next, then line editing, copy editing, continuity, and voice. Each rung finished before the next begins. If you're ready to go deeper, to see the full diagnostic checklists for each rung, the opening promise concept, and a printable style sheet template you can use on your next manuscript, the self-editing ladder power tool is waiting for you in the fictionbrain.com library.